Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I've got the wonderful Beth with me today. Beth, how are you?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you? It's been a while since we've done one of these together.
It has. It's been a very long time, it feels. And we've got a bit of a case of deja vu today, haven't we?
Just a little bit. We're joined this afternoon by Karl Shaw. Now, we've spoken with Karl before, about almost a year ago, I think, if not that. Maybe, about a year or so, when we talked about his book, The Killing of Lloyd George, which we both highly enjoyed. But Karl is a writer and historian who has written books such as The Mammoth Book of Losers, which always another excellent title, The Killing of Lloyd George, as we said, we spoke about last year, and he's back again. We love having our repeat guests, and he's back to talk to us about his book, The First Showman, The Extraordinary Mr Astley, the Englishman who invented the modern circus. So, Karl, hello, welcome back to History Hack.
Hello, it's great to be talking to you again.
Wonderful. So, let's just jump right in. Obviously, the man who is this book refers to, the extraordinary Mr. Astley, Philip Astley. Let's talk a little bit about his background, as it were, and how he sort of comes to be where he is, because he has quite a rise in his life, doesn't he?
He does, yes. Philip Astley, he was born in 1742 in Newcastle-under-Lyme in North Staffordshire. He was the son of a cabinet maker, and that for a while was also the trade that he was apprenticed to. But he had a very poor relationship with his father, Edward. Edward Astley was an unreliable parent, and he was in and out of debtor's prison. And so when Philip was 17, he ran away from home and he joined the army. He signed up for the legendary Fighting 15th Light Dragoons, and he served overseas fighting for his country in the 7 Years' War. He very quickly became a master horseman, a swordsman, and he was a war hero. And he distinguished himself in battle. He captured an enemy standard, and he saved the life of the Duke of Brunswick. And he rose to the rank of sergeant major when he was a relatively young man. And I think that if he'd stayed in the army, he would have had a great career, and he would have probably gone on and become risen to the rank of general. He was that sort of person. As a token of appreciation for his conspicuous bravery, he was discharged from the army, and they gave him a horse. His old commanding officer gave him a horse, and this would be his meal ticket in Civvy Street, and the beginning of an even more famous career as the creator of the modern circus. So he invented what the world came to know as the greatest show on earth. For a while, he was the most famous entertainer in Britain. He toured the whole country. At a time when most top performers, they would stray no further than London or the major cities. He went absolutely everywhere. And he had a famous building in London called Astley's Amphitheatre, and going to Astley's was an instantly identifiable storyline, and it was used by some of the greatest writers of the day, including Charles Dickens, Austen and Thackeray, amongst others. And he ranked in importance and popularity with the greatest theatrical characters of the age. And the circus was an incredibly popular format, and within 50 years of Philip Astley's death in 1814, there was a circus on almost every continent.
So he has quite an impact, doesn't he? But before we get into that, and this sounds, even though I wrote it, I've reread the question again and again. It just sounds stupid. But what was London like when he got back from war before we started? Because it is very, very different to what it is now, which I know is a very dumb thing to say, but
yes, it was a very important city, but it was a very dangerous time politically in London. That summer, the summer that when he first put on his first circus acts, there was some of the worst urban violence in modern British history. The Gordon riots. A couple of years earlier, the government had started to relax strict laws denying Catholics the right to vote and so on. And there were many Protestants who were very unhappy about the reforms, and there were wide-scale riots throughout London. And the protest quickly turned into an out-of-control mob, and they went burning and destroying everything they came across. And for about a week, London was submerged in the throes of civil war, and there was a mob raging across the capital. So there were very difficult times.
So obviously it's a different environment than the London, as Chris said, the London we're used to. But it's interesting that sort of political stage, that's what's going on in the background is highlighting his first summer as a showman. What are the first steps that he sort of takes into taking on this role? Because I don't imagine that you wake up one morning and go, right, I'm going to have a circus, I'm going to be a showman. I imagine there's stuff that leads up to that.
Well, it almost happened by accident. So to begin with, he was an incredible horseman. And by the way, he married a lady called Patty Jones, and she was also an incredible, very accomplished rider. And they decided simply that they wanted to set up a riding school. But they knew that there was a lot of money to be made at that time by trick riding. It was an incredibly popular attraction all over London. I think in North London and Islington, there were venues where thousands of people would go on a Sunday and see these people performing the most incredible feats on horseback. It was hugely popular. So to begin with, he and Patty just wanted to do a bit of trick riding to raise enough money to set up a riding school. But they found out that there was so much money to be made from the daredevil trick riding that's what they stuck to. So in 1768, they found a very muddy field on the south bank of the Thames in Lambeth, and he staked out a 42-foot or 13-metre ring, and people came from miles around to watch them do these amazing tricks on horseback. So they would perform acrobatics on the back of the horse while he was galloping around this tiny ring. He'd ride with one foot on the saddle and the other foot touching his head. He could mount and dismount his horse at full gallop. He could vault over 2 or 3 horses or stand on one leg, lay on a horseback. I think he could actually perform a headstand in the saddle as the horse was cantering around the ring as well. His wife's speciality, by the way, was that she could ride around the ring covered with a swarm of bees. So from that beginning, quite simply, Philip had an old war wound and it was playing him up, and he couldn't manage several performances a day. So one day he had the idea to give them a break from the trick riding, of putting a clown in the ring. And that was quite popular. So then he hired some acrobats and then some strongmen and so on. So the day that Philip Astley put the clown in the ring, that was truly the birth of the modern circus. And that 42 feet or 13-metre ring became the global standard, and it's still used 250 years later. It doesn't vary anywhere else in the world. And he was finally forced into retirement from his trick riding at the age of 38 because of his old injuries. So he assumed the role of ringmaster, circus ringmaster. So that's another role he also invented. And some of the kind of slapstick circus routines that he was doing 250 years ago are still staples of the circus all around the world to this day, with some slight variations. And the interesting thing is that Astley's original circus was all about amazing horsemanship and human feats of skill and daring. It's fair to say that in those days, human sensitivity to animal suffering was not widely shared in Georgian England, to put it mildly. But Astley believed that the only way to train his horses was with kindness. He didn't exhibit wild animals. and the introduction of lions and elephants, that only came fashionable long after his death. And I think it's fair to say that the mistreatment of circus animals in the century after his death has perhaps made some people a little bit wary about celebrating the circus. But Philip Astley was never a part of that. His circus was just about horsemanship and human feats of skill.
So he really does sort of set the blueprint, doesn't he?
Yeah, he really did set the global standard. And even in his old regimental colours of gold and red and blue, they are still the standard circus colours to this day. And they use, most circuses still use brass bands, and that's what he started out with. So yeah, he definitely laid down the template.
Because theatre and sort of outside entertainment, I mean, we on History Hack don't like Cromwell anyway, but Cromwell really sort of got rid of all that sort of stuff in the 1640s and 50s. How had entertainment changed in the century before Astley came along?
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right. Oliver Cromwell really rang the death knell for theatre in Britain, and he had them all shut down in 1642. When the theatres reopened under King Charles II, the king issued just 2 royal patents, one to Drury Lane and the other to Covent Garden. And they were the only theatres who had the right to put on theatrical entertainments legally. And at the same time, they were banning anybody else from doing the same. So effectively, the 2 theatres royal, situated within a few yards of each other in Covent Garden, they had a duopoly over the whole London theatre. Obviously, 2 theatres just couldn't, satisfy public demand, and there were still illegal theatres and other entertainments springing up all over. At first, the authorities used to turn a blind eye, but in 1737, the government drove through an infamous Licensing Act, and from now on, anyone performing a play without a licence could be thrown into prison, and all new plays had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain for vetting, and anyone failing to comply could be heavily fined or put out of business. And that was the situation actually that existed more or less until the 1960s. As far as the circus is concerned, you could argue the toss as to whether a circus is theatre, but the law decided that circus was a theatre, so technically Philip Astley, he needed a licence to operate. He wasn't the sort of person that cared much for rules and regulations, so he just ignored them. And he carried on without a licence. So basically, for most of his career, he operated illegally, and he was always under the threat of being closed down and thrown into prison, which in fact he once was, but it didn't bother him in the slightest, and he just carried on as before.
Excellent. I mean, I like someone who doesn't stick to the rules, and the fact that he just kept going. Good for him. So let's just sort of move forward a little bit, and you have to illuminate our listeners on this, because this was something I don't know about either. I had not heard of it before it was mentioned in your book. Let us talk about the Circus War. What on earth is it? Who did it happen between? How long did it go on for? And how does that relate to Astley and sort of his progression and where he takes circus?
Well, it obviously didn't go unnoticed by Philip Astley's competitors in the local entertainment industry, that he was doing very well out of his new circus format. It was incredibly popular, and he was making a huge amount of money. And there were a lot of people who were very jealous of his success, and naturally there were a few people who wanted to copy what he'd done. He didn't mind competition, because he always believed that his was the best, and he was, head and shoulders above everybody else. But then, about 4 years after he started up, one of his old employees, there was a young horseman, a trick rider called Charles Hughes. He set up an almost identical circus business just a few hundred yards away from Astley's. And when Hughes's new circus opened, it was clear that it was almost a direct copy of Astley's show. Now, when Astley saw that Hughes's show was almost a replica of his own, he was absolutely livid. And he was a big guy, and he wasn't a guy to be crossed, really. And he trusted Hughes and treated him well as an employee. And it seemed to him that all along Hughes was using him for his own ends. And as far as Astley was concerned, this was the vilest treachery. And it got personal and quite nasty. And for a number of years, each man tried to outclass and destroy the other's business. And this went on and on. There were furious sort of near-libelous exchanges in the newspapers. For example, on one occasion, 3 of Hughes's best horses died in mysterious circumstances. And Hughes blamed Astley. He claimed he poisoned them. And Astley felt sufficiently slighted, he had to issue an angry denial and threaten to sue Hughes. And so it went on, and it got very, very ugly, and it lasted a number of years. But actually, the upshot was that their public rivalry was really good for both venues, because not only did it generate publicity, people would go to both shows to see what the fuss was all about. But the competition, of course, also spurred Astley on to create ever more ambitious and exciting entertainments. And probably, if Charles Hughes hadn't set up shop right next door to Astley's and this war hadn't started, I don't think the circus would have been nearly as good, because he was forced to kind of, bring in the best entertainments from all over the world, really, into Lambeth.
Bit of healthy competition.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I'm probably going to butcher my French pronunciation has always been quite bad, but is this what leads to the amphitheatre Anglais?
You got it, yeah. Well, Astley's ambitions always extended far beyond his own country. He relished the opportunity to take his brand new circus entertainment to new audiences in unfamiliar and challenging surroundings, and eventually he would travel all over Europe with his circus. But he really loved France, and every year during the English off-season, he would tour France with his show, and the French absolutely loved him, probably even more so than in England. And he performed a couple of times for the King of France at Versailles. And it had always been Astley's ambition to open a permanent circus in Paris. And so that's what he did. The Amphitheatre Anglais was a wooden structure with a ground plan laid out exactly as you'd expect a modern circus to look. And every autumn, as soon as his London amphitheatre closed, the Astleys left Lambeth and they took themselves off to Paris. And they'd spend 3 months of the year in the Amphitheatre Anglais. And he absolutely took Paris by storm and left a great circus legacy in France, to the extent that I would say to this day the name Philip Astley is still much better known in France than it is in the UK. And I went to Paris last year to look up the place where he started his first circus, and there's a monument there to it. There's a plaque, and it will tell you all about the great Philip Astley. There's not so much here, though, which is a shame. And of course, eventually he retired to Paris, and he's buried there.
So that's quite interesting that his sort of notoriety post his death is actually in France rather than necessarily in the UK, when we all know what a circus is, and we all have been to circuses at some point in our life. But before sort of this podcast and looking up for it, I couldn't really have told you who had any sort of massive role in getting that to where it is. So I found that very interesting that he's so prevalent in France, in French history.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I also live in Newcastle-under-Lyme, which is where Philip Astley was born. And I'd never heard of him until about a few years ago. And I thought, first of all, why haven't I heard of this guy? I'd like to think, I know a little bit about history, and I'd like to think I knew a little bit about the local history. Never heard of him. And the other thing that struck me is, how do you invent the circus? I thought that was an extraordinary concept. Surely it's always been around. I just thought it was one of those things that had been around since, I don't know, the Romans.
Yeah.
But it hadn't. He sat down and thought about it, And he created a format, the ring, the 42-metre ring, and the clowns and everything else. And it was absolutely his. Nobody else had done it.
Yeah. And so, obviously, we've just talked about his time in France. What happens? What's his next moves when he gets back to London? Like, is he planning to expand? Is he planning to differentiate on the types of entertainment, or is he wanting to get even bigger and better, or is he just happy with what he's doing?
No, he was very, very ambitious, and these were his golden years, really. Back in London, he built himself a grand new circus, and it was near to Westminster Bridge, just right across the River Thames from the Houses of Parliament. Astley's Amphitheatre, as it was known. And despite being enormously fat, he was also an expert swimmer, and he promoted his new enterprise by floating down the Thames on his back from Westminster to Blackfriars, waving a Union Jack in each hand. So he really was a showman. But Astley's Amphitheatre was one of the most famous venues in London. Like most of his circuses, it was built from wood and it burned down twice, but he just rebuilt it and started over again. And during this period, Astley's became, as I said, one of the most famous venues in London, and the building was still being used for circus entertainments for about another 100 years after his death. He had his fingers in all sorts of pies. There were various other activities as well. I mean, every year on the 4th of June from 1783, at his own expense, he'd throw a giant annual outdoor firework display to honour the King George III's birthday. And at these events, he'd have the latest pyrotechnics, which were considered hugely successful, although there was the odd fatality. I think in 1792, his head carpenter was killed by an explosion of gunpowder while making the fireworks. And in the meantime, he toured extensively in Europe. So these were great years for Astley, and I would say he was probably the best known performer in England, because he went on the road and he toured the whole of Britain, and he was definitely really well known in London as well.
We've kind of mentioned bits about his personality. I love the image of him floating down the river with two Union Jacks. Very reminiscent of a former mayor of London coming down getting stuck on a zip line, but that sort of showing off thing. It's pretty awesome. But what was he like as a person, though?
Well, as a physical presence, I mean, he was literally larger than life, and he was impossible to ignore. As I mentioned, in his later years, he put on a lot of weight. But when he was a young man, he was very athletic, very broad-shouldered. He was over 6 feet tall at a time when the average height was around about 5'7". He was barrel-chested, and he had a voice like a foghorn. And he was known to everyone as Big Philip. And another nickname he had was the handsomest man in England. So he was quite a striking figure. He was a very forceful personality. He was huge. He was outrageous, booming, opinionated man. And it's reasonable to assume he wasn't always the easiest to get along with. He had quite a hot temper, and he could threaten. He could sort of switch from being charming to quite threatening, just in an instant. He was very deeply and fiercely loyal to king and country. He was very proud of his credentials as a war hero, and he wasn't shy about telling people about it. He used to tell his paying customers many times, he'd say, I have bled for my country many times, and I will gladly bleed for it again. And he was a patriot, but he wasn't a xenophobe. I mean, he worked all over Europe, and he made Paris his second home. And he brought to his circus French people, Germans, Italians, Spanish performers. And during his lifetime, he provided work for people all over the world. I mean, there's no sugarcoating the fact that he really was a ruthless competitor. But I think you needed to be tough to survive in the cutthroat world of Georgian showmen. He had to be tough. But he was doing this 100 years before, P.T. Barnum, the American circus impresario. I mean, Astley set the bar in this profession, and he was trailblazing advertising and promotional techniques, posters, publicity stunts, and pre-show parades before anybody else thought of it. But he never adopted the cheating practices of Barnum and some of those others who followed. He was essentially, Astley was an honest man, and he believed in giving his audience good value. And his shows were always of the highest quality that he could possibly manage. And he was a huge, brave man.
And I suppose, much like any other thing that happened in the Georgian era, there is one thing that we can sort of bookend the entire period with is the Industrial Revolution and the changes in, people moving from the countryside to the city for work opportunities, and the change in culture and the change in society. All sort of, there's a massive, massive change at that time. How was Astley and his business affected by that age of revolution?
It helped in one sense because people had the Industrial Revolution. Really, it put more money into people's pockets, and so ordinary people could go out and see his entertainments. I think, and there was a revolution abroad as well. The French Revolution hit his business hard financially. He had to close his Paris venue and stop touring Europe. And I think the other big knock-on effect on his life personally was that in 1793, as a result of the French Revolution, Britain went to war with France again. And the British Army was desperate for volunteers. And so desperate, in fact, that when Philip Astley volunteered his services to King and Country, he was allowed to re-enlist in his old regiment at the grand old age of 51, which is pretty much unheard of. And at this point, he wasn't too well. He got old war wounds. He had illness. He 51 years old. That was quite a considerable age to be doing something, joining the army again in those days. He had a lame leg, and his wife and his son thought he was absolutely mad. And by this time, he was an internationally famous theatrical manager, but off he went to Flanders to fight in the war, which was quite amazing. And he also spent a considerable sum of his own money to provide his regiment with better clothing. He brought loads of flannel, and he set all the women at his amphitheatre to work making waistcoats for all the men in his regiment.
Wow, that's really quite impressive. Especially, like you said, 51 and going to war in the Georgian period is, unless you're a general, that's pretty unheard of. Yeah,
it was an extraordinary thing to do. He'd done it all once as a young man, and he went and did it again, and it caused quite a stir at the time because he was internationally famous. And the idea of this guy just upping sticks and going off to fight for his country was truly extraordinary at the age of 51.
Did he see much action while he was out there?
The second time around, I don't think he did. He was sort of in charge of all the horses because I think he was his company's resident horse master. But all the time he was out there as well, he was making notes and he was sending he was sending them home. And his back at Astley's amphitheatre, they were laying on entertainments based on some of the battles that he'd heard about. So he was sort of making a bit of a profit for himself as well. He was sort of the very early war correspondent, if you like. Yeah.
Well, why not make it work for you? Yeah. But one of his proteges, sort of to bookend this, takes a circus on tour from Philadelphia to St. Petersburg, doesn't he?
Yeah. There's his old nemesis Charles Hughes, this was the guy who'd set up the circus that had sparked the war of the circuses. Charles Hughes took himself off to Russia to work with, I guess she was the most notorious woman of the age, Empress Catherine the Great. And the Russian court were huge fans of English horsemanship. English horsemanship apparently was the best in Europe. And so she imported a load of English thoroughbred horses, and Charles Hughes ran that side of things for a while. for her. And Charles Hughes is often given the credit for introducing the circus to Russia. Might be overstating it slightly because his shows only consisted of trick riding. There were no acrobats or clowns or jugglers or all the other bits and pieces that we associate with the circus. But he does deserve credit for bringing the main attraction of the circus, which was the riding act, into the circus ring to Russia. He took that to Russia. And without Hughes, the Russian circus would have never taken off so quickly or become so all-conquering, because it's incredibly important in Russia, the circus is. I think we've all heard of the Moscow State Circus that used to tour the UK from, I don't know if they still do. No, they probably don't do it at the moment, but they used to back in the day. The Moscow State Circus was a big thing over here. So it's fair to say that Charles Hughes was a very important mainspring of an institution that would one day become one of Russia's greatest cultural exports. And while Hughes was making the circus popular in Russia, another former apprentice of Astley's was trying his luck at the other end of the world. There was a guy called John Bill Ricketts. He was born in Staffordshire, and in 1793 he went to America, and he opened America's first ever circus in Philadelphia. And at that time, Philadelphia was the US capital, I think. He opened on the corner of 12th and Market Streets. He built a circus arena identical to Astley's, and these performances owed more or less everything he'd learned from Astley, and it was a mixture of horse riding, acrobatics, rope dancing and clowning. And of course, we all know about the American circus. It's, the biggest in the world. And as for Astley, I mean, his final years weren't great. His health deteriorated. His touch for finding new talent and new businesses had started to desert him. His last venture, which was a new circus he opened just off the Strand in London, that made colossal losses, and he was forced to sell. And he took himself off to Paris and retired, and he died in his 72nd year from what was termed gout in the stomach. And he was buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery, which is quite a famous cemetery where the likes of, I can't think of the top of it, who was built in? Jim Morrison.
Jim Morrison's buried there.
Yeah. And they've lost Astley's grave. They can't locate it, but there are people working on that to try and find where he is again. The other sad thing was that Astley, he really wanted to start his own circus dynasty, but he had a son called John. He was a very highly talented guy, and he was a circus celebrity in his own right, John Astley was, but he was killed he drank himself to death, basically. And so Philip Astley, although still revered all the world over as the father of the circus, the shame is that he was all but forgotten in his homeland. And so on the 250th anniversary of the first circus, which was actually shortly before COVID, the hardback version of the first showman, The Extraordinary Mr Astley, was published. And in January, the paperback version will be published as well.
Wonderful. Well, that's been very interesting and very illuminating for both of us. So thank you very much, Karl, for coming to talk to us about your book, The Extraordinary Mr Astley, and hopefully many of our listeners will look forward to it as well.
It's been my pleasure, yes, and I hope they do, because he really was. It really is a great story, yeah.
And one that doesn't deserve to be sort of, I don't want to use the word forgotten, but, sort of misplaced in popular culture.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.